Paua ki runga, paua ki raro, paua ki tā more more nui no papa, paua ki tā more more nui no rangi. Tēnā tawi to pau kātū ki hei rū ki hei ngārue. He manawa au, he manawa piri, he manawa toka tēnei, tō manawa ka pau tai ki te anoho. Tō manawa, he manawa ora, he ora, turu turu o witi waka maua ki a tīna, tīna, aumie, ui e, taiki. Nō reira, kei ngā uri o tō tātou tau eke maunga taranaki huri rauna i haia, tatu atu rā ki te motu me te ao, nau mai rā koutou kia piri, nau mai rā koutou kia tata, ki tēnei pānuitanga kōrero e pāna ki ngā neke neke hanga mō te kāhui tupua, mō ngā maunga e tūnei ki te taiuru. Nō reira, tēnei rā, te mihi kia koutou katoa, i roto i ngā neke neke hanga o te wā, me te wai wakaaro ano oki ki ho tātou tini aitua, huri rauna i ngā marae maha o tō tātou tupuna. Nō reira, hui hui a mai rā o tātou mate, kia tangitahi rā rā tātou i tēnei pō. Nō reira rātou kia rātou, hoi anō rā e te iwi, ko tātou he nei ngā kanuhi o rau rātou, kawe tonu nei, kōkiri tonu nei ngā mai. Nō reira, nei rā māua ko taku tua ine, a Liana e mihi aroha nei kia koutou, koutou kua hono mai rā morunga mo tēnei kaupapa i te pōnei. Nō reira, kua ana te ngākau, ko whai wāhi māua ki te wakatakoto, i ngā kōrero me ngā neke neke anga, e pāna ki tēnei kaupapa nui. Nō reira, uri noa, tēnā koutou, ka tuku nātu rā kia koe kei taku tua ine.
Tēnā koe, Jamie, nāu whakatuwhera tō tātou nei hui te pōnei, te ahiahi pōnei. Kei konei māua ko Jamie kia whakamārama atu kia koutou. Kei hea tātou, kei hea ngā whakataunga mō tō tātou nei maunga, o tātou nei maunga. Nā reira, kei konei māua kia whakamārama atu, kia whakautua i ngā pātai hoki. Nā reira, e mii ana kia koutou kua hono mai i tēnei pō. So thank you everybody for joining us. Some of you, this will be probably your 4th, 5th, 10th time seeing this update presentation. But we just thank you for joining in. As you know, we are looking to initial our agreement, our redress agreement for our Maunga this coming Friday, the 31st of March. And so we wanted to take the opportunity tonight to have a really big update to let everybody know exactly where we're at. So for tonight, there are the comment section where you can post up any pātai. We're going to monitor the pātai as we go along through the presentation. If we don't get to answer them as a part of the presentation, we're going to be keeping track of them so that at the end of the presentation, we can go back and answer some of the unanswered pātai. And also, if you have any pātai towards the end of the presentation, we'll open up at that point to let you know where we're going. So I think Jamie and I are just going to tag team and share the presentation. And so I think we'll just get into it from now. Yeah. Bye.
Well, ka pai whānau. So as Liana outlined, it's really an opportunity to recap on background to date in terms of the process that we have been a part of for the last 6 years. We'll talk about our framework, he kawa tupua, and then how that framework has led to the elements of the Maunga arrangements that we've negotiated to date. We'll talk about the next steps and then have pātai at the end. But as Liana said, feel free to post your pātai in the chat and we'll endeavour to either note those pātai to address them at the end or alternatively cover them off as we go through the respective sides. And just I love when we present referring to this particular kōrero whakawai. Kōrero whakawai being a word that we use in Taranaki for whakatauki. But this kōrero really embodies the approach we've taken as a collective of iwi of Taranaki. E kore hoki e tae e mate no te iwi kotahi, which reminds us that, through our unity and through working together and being united, we will not be overcome. And certainly this particular kaupapa around our maunga has been one that has united our 8 iwi, and we've sought to embrace this particular whakawai kōrero here, which also reminds us that if we are united, we're able to achieve wonderful things. And that's certainly been a key focus for Liana, myself, and our negotiating team as we've embarked on this process to ensure that we maintain that unity, that collaborative spirit and approach. In terms of background, it's really important. So for those of you that aren't familiar, and I've got the piece here from the Ngāti Ruanui Deed of Settlement, effectively what happened with each of the 8 iwi settlements was that the Taranaki Maunga redress was not negotiated at an individual iwi level. And it was recorded in each of the deeds of settlement that once all iwi had negotiated their settlement arrangements, that we would come together to negotiate an apology and cultural redress in relation to our tupuna maunga. And that in itself was triggered when Ngāti Maru gained their mandate to pursue their comprehensive claims. And we'll talk a little bit about what this sort of means in terms of the Crown approach and the constraints that they placed upon us when we embarked on the process. But fundamentally here, there was an agreement in each of the individual settlements that we would negotiate arrangements and redress for the Maunga collectively. So we had an arrangement where we had an MOU between the 8 iwi. The MOU basically put in place the manner in which we would work together collectively as iwi of Taranaki. It also provided a framework by which negotiators would be appointed to pursue our settlement negotiations on behalf of our collective, and the reporting requirements, etc. And so we have here our negotiating team, and you'll see on the left-hand side there we have Whaitihi Noble, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago whilst she was working with us as a negotiator. Nō reira, ka rere tunu ngā mihi ki aia. And then you have the sort of balance there, Liana, Haimona, Tapaunga, Davis, Hemi Sundgren, and myself. And whānau, these photos were taken 6 years ago when we embarked on this process, so we all look a bit younger there. But so that's our core negotiating team, and we have worked collectively to advance our kaupapa on our collective behalf. And when we established the working relationship, the memorandum of understanding with our iwi, the negotiating team, having clear kaupapa was central to guiding the way in which we would work together, and also how we would formulate our approach and interact with the Crown. We really just got some of the key kaupapa or principles that we outlined from the outset. You'll see there at the top is mana motuhake. Mana motuhake tanga was one of the key principles, because throughout the process there was a desire from each of the iwi to be able to retain their mana motuhake tanga within any of the arrangements that we negotiated. And through the course of the presentation, we'll point out and call out some of those aspects where, you know, again, we've sought to ensure mana motuhake tanga of iwi and hapu, whilst also seeing the benefit of working collaboratively, tēnei mea te mahitahi me te kotahitanga. But the key thing here, whānau, is that we've been guided by these principles, and we've sought to bring these principles to life through the work that we've done in negotiating the arrangements with the Crown. And when we embarked on this process, so we kicked this process off some time ago. It was back in back end of 2016, which was following Ngāti Maru achieving their mandate to negotiate settlement. And when the Crown came to see us, they basically came with this framework, or we've called it ngā here whakatakotori e te krauna. You know, a here is a constraint, basically. They call them parameters. But they were parameters that the Crown basically said we would be operating within when negotiating redress over our maunga. And you'll see there that that the national park status would remain. You'll see there that there was a desire from the Crown for existing conservation and recreation values to be retained and maintained. That the redress negotiated need to be fit for purpose and durable. Very much the Crown had in mind consistency with previous settlements and existing treaty policy. And then you'll see the last one there, that Tuuta would not be replicated. And the interesting piece around Tuuta is that Tuuta was a national park, and that national park sort of status was removed. Legal personhood was placed upon Tuuta, but slightly different arrangements there. And I guess the second to last bullet point was really our opportunity to be able to develop our framework, our aspirations to advance those key aspects that we wanted to see as iwi of Taranaki. And that's really where our focus went, around what our aspirations were and are. So just for those of our whānau that aren't familiar with the process, this process is slightly different to your standard treaty settlement process, albeit it has the same sort of similar aspects and steps within it. But you'll see there the first box, the mandate was recognised. That was really triggered by, as I said earlier, Ngāti Maru. And just over 6 years ago, 14th of March 2016, we signed a terms of negotiation as 8 iwi of Taranaki with the former Minister for Treaty of Waitangi Negotiations, Christopher Finlayson. And since that time, we've developed our aspirations framework. On the 20th of December 2017, we entered into Ruruku Pūtakerongo, where we recorded the progress that had been made up until that date, because that was prior to a looming election. And since 2017 until the present time, we've been working on the broader arrangements and details that will be captured within a collective redress deed. And we'll come back to the following steps towards the back end of the presentation. Key thing here, whānau, when we're talking about the Maunga settlement, as you know, sort of for settlement negotiations and redress, the Crown will only negotiate over Crown assets and land. And so we're really talking about what is known today as the National Park, which is the dark green area there. So it's just under 36,000 hectares, our Maunga. And it's our Maunga plural, because there are multiple Maunga there. And so that's just a reminder of what we're talking about. But I might hand over to Liana to sort of outline he kaua tupua.
Tēnā koe, Jamie. So he kaua tupua, when we started this process, we decided that actually we wanted to set out a set of aspirations for the negotiations. And we also wanted to understand how we might frame up what we are seeking within the negotiations. So you'll see there that karakia, it's a well-known karakia in Taranaki, and we talked about he kaua tupua being the framework within which we would negotiate. And so everything that we've negotiated, all the discussions we've had with the Crown have been centred on achieving this particular framework. And if we click over to the next one, you'll see there that there are 2 pou under he kaua tupua. So the first is ko te mana o ngā maunga, and this is all about focusing on our maunga, recognising, promoting them, protecting their health and well-being, and I guess really the key element within ko te mana o ngā maunga is recognising them as tupuna. And then the second part of the framework, the negotiations framework, is ko te mana o te kāhui. And that really is about our connection as uri mokopuna of those maunga, and how we recognise the relationship that we have with them, but also how we provide for reconnection in some case, and for that relationship to be developed in an ongoing manner. So essentially, he kaua tupua is our negotiation framework, and all of the elements that we've negotiated within the redress package sit under one or other of these pou of the framework. I should probably just say that the way that we've framed this is sort of in that kind of hierarchy of promoting our tupuna maunga as being above us as uri mokopuna. And often that's not the way things are seen in a current day context. And so the way that we've framed up this framework is to understand te mana o ngā maunga te mea nui, and kei raro iho ko te mano o te kāhui. So our tupuna are the first and foremost focus for us within these negotiations, and then our relationships with our tupuna follow that. Ka pai, Jay, I think we're into our kōrero tuku iho.
Ka pai. So as Liana sort of indicated, we've been very intentional around setting the hierarchy around, first and foremost, our maunga, secondly, ourselves as uri. And one of the other aspects of our approach to negotiations, the redress, and what we've recorded in the deed is to ensure that where possible, we're bringing to life our ways of being and knowing, that we're using our reo, and then we're applying a collective Taranaki iwi lens to what lies within the various documentation. And so to set the scene within the context of what we've called Te Ruruku Pūtakerongo, or the deed of agreement, we start off with he karakiatanga kōrero tuku iho. An example of one of our karakiatanga kōrero, which gives a view of how our maunga came to be. And this is just one example of many that are seen within Taranaki, and it gives a narrative from the time in which the North Island was fished from the water through to the whakapapa that led to the emergence of Rua Taranaki here in the west coast of the North Island. So that sort of sets the scene. And beyond that, one of the key aspects we were looking at was recording statements of association, or having each of our iwi record their relationship with our maunga. And over time, what we then sort of looked to do was to really sort of build a narrative, a collective narrative around the sort of key elements that reflect our understanding, our relationship of our maunga at a higher level. And there we've called this te iho tā ngaingai. And within these statements are three key aspects. So the first being he pau wakaruru. And we embarked on this process by recording this understanding i roto i te reo Māori in our own language, and then translated it into English. And what you see here is it really just sort of describes that connection and that feeling of the maunga, and how the maunga influence and impact us as people, but also the physical attributes of our region. The second sort of dimension we have is he pau taiora. And so he pau taiora very much speaks to those physical aspects of the landscape, which have been shaped and formed by the volcanic activity. And so again, we're describing that using our language, using our understanding through our lens, and it sets the context. And then the final pau there is he pau wānanga, he pau kōrero, he pau kura, recognising the important role that the maunga have in terms of shaping us as uri, but broadly speaking, people, in terms of what the maunga offers physically, but also how it's shaped our knowledge systems and our understandings, our art forms, and all of those sorts of things. So again, we've thought we've got a whakapapa of our understanding of how maunga came to be, and importantly, these three pau capture sort of all of those elements, those both tangible and intangible, physical, metaphysical elements of what our maunga represent, and how that gives that sort of emotion for us as uri mokopuna of our maunga. And so one element of, so we've got, here's our understanding of our maunga, how we describe our maunga, and within the Te Ruruku Pūtakerongo, there are some standard elements that you see in many settlements. And each of the sections within Te Ruruku Pūtakerongo starts with one of our own statements, i roto i tō tātou reo. So we start with a kōrero whakawai, or a karakiatanga kōrero. And so for this particular section, which covers off the historical account, the acknowledgement and apology, we start with the statement, hai hai a te pō, kia tū mai ngā witu, which really sort of highlights the fact that as part of acknowledging this experience that we've had with the Crown acknowledging its wrongdoing, its harm, and apologising for that, it provides an opportunity for us to emerge from a grievance state into a more forward-looking future state. And that's why we've called this section Te Puiatanga ki te ao. Key thing here, whānau, the historical account is actually it's a great document, very much led out by Hemi Sundgren, working alongside one of the Crown historians, and it covers off that experience. And I think one of the things we always record is that with the historical account, it's an agreed historical account, so it's agreed with the Crown, and so it doesn't always sort of use the language or cover off everything that we would like to see. However, in saying that, I think the historical account itself is a very good record of that experience of loss, harm, disenfranchisement, and the attempts that our whānau have made over many years to not only assert our mana, but to have the mana of our maunga recognised. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those aspects when we go through the presentation, because this fight for recognition of our maunga and our iwi of Taranaki has been long-standing and has been hard fought by previous generations. And this is but another step forward after many taking many steps before us. And so it's really important that we acknowledge the contribution of many of our tauheke and others that have gone before us. Ready to go, Liana?
Ka pai, sub you out, give you give you a break. So ko te mana o ngā maunga, we've talked about this. This is one of the pou, the first of two pou under our He Kaua Tupua negotiation framework. And so again, within this pou or under this pou are redress mechanisms that recognise, promote and protect the health and well-being of our maunga. And it also records and recognises their status as tupuna. So I'll take you through each part of that. So I know you won't be able to read all of this, and that's okay. So on this screen there are 11 different key components or redress components that sit under ko te mana o ngā maunga. The most important one, and the first one at the top left-hand corner, is te kāhui tupua, and that is creating a legal personality for our tupuna. So one of the key instructions, I guess, we got at the beginning of our negotiations, Jamie, was that our people didn't want the Crown to own our tupuna. And equally, when we got into negotiations, we thought actually it doesn't sit well that we should own them either, because they're our tupuna. And so then came a discussion around legal personality. So essentially, we were creating a legal person for our tupuna. It will be a collective, so we've used te kāhui tupua to include the multiple tupuna within the national park area. And what will happen with that is they will become a legal person just like you and I. So we will talk through that, but that concept of legal personality underpins all 11 of these redress components under ko te mana o ngā maunga. So I'll take you through now each of those and talk a little bit about what they mean. So I've talked about te kāhui tupua being recognised, and so here we've described te kāhui tupua as being a living and indivisible whole comprising Taranaki and other tupuna maunga. So we've said there including Pauakai, Kaitake, but there are others, Panitahi, Te Ringaniu, Patuha. And so one of the key components of recognising te kāhui tupua is that we recognise everything about them, their physical, metaphysical elements. So metaphysical is more like the spiritual kind of cultural elements of them, and that actually our tupuna don't stop at the boundary of the national park. They actually go beyond that, and we know that, but we wanted to be able to record that for the Crown, obviously, but also for the the rest of the community, so that they really get an understanding that our tupuna doesn't stop at the edge of the national park, and that they are all encompassing and go beyond that. So in terms of the status, so I talked about Te Kāhui Tupua having all the rights, powers, duties, responsibilities of a legal person. And essentially that means just like you and I as people, we can own assets, we can appear in court, we can make submissions to council. There are a whole lot of things that we can do as people, and so that will be bestowed upon our tupuna as well. And so there will be, and we'll talk about the other element of that, because obviously, to be able to be in court and submit, you need someone to undertake that role on your behalf, or on their behalf in this case. So we'll talk about how that works shortly. One of the things that we were clear about, and Jamie talked about the principles we entered into the MOU with the other iwi on, and that was really around ensuring that nothing that is in this redress package diminishes or displaces or comes in over the top of the role that hapu and iwi already have in relation to our tupuna. Or Te Kāhui Tupua going forward. So we've been really clear that although Te Kāhui Tupua can do all of these things as a legal person, it actually doesn't go over top, and it probably enhances the role of hapu and iwi in terms of being able to advocate for certain things on behalf of our tupuna and on behalf of themselves. So that's sort of a bit of a snapshot, and we'll keep talking about it because there's a lot to unpack in terms of this legal personality concept. So ngā pou whakatupua, we'll hand over to you, Jay.
Ka pai. So ngā pou whakatupua. So one of the key aspects when thinking about our approach and our framework moving forward around what we had negotiated. So it's one thing to have our tupuna recognised as a legal person, and as Liana's outlined what that means. But secondly, a key focus for us was to ensure that there was a set of values to guide decision makers at every level around what they do in relation to Te Kāhui Tupua. And so we have developed a set of what you might call Maunga values, and we've called these ngā pou wakatupua. Again, we've started this particular section with a karakiatanga kōrero, which is fitting given the historical sort of context of this karakia, and also what it reflects and represents in a contemporary context. And so the pou whakatupua are essentially a set of intrinsic values which will guide those decision makers, but ultimately reflect our ways of being and knowing, and how we view and how we view our tupuna and our relationship with them. And so many people look at these and think, wow, ko te kāhui tupua he rārangi maunga here anuku here arangi. And that in itself is a statement which really reaffirms what the te kāhui tupua status, because what that sort of says is that we see our maunga holistically. It's a bit like how we view our taiao. We view our taiao very much holistically. And so really this particular value here reinforces and reflects this concept of Te Kāhui Tupua being a living and indivisible whole, incorporating the physical and metaphysical elements. And so that's the first one. The second kōrero there, ko Te Kāhui Tupua, ko ia ko ho mātou nei oki-okinga, ko mātou nei tō rātou oki-okitanga. That one, many of you will probably be familiar with the kōrero ko au te awa ko te awa ko au, our whānau from Te Awa Tupua. Well, essentially this is our version of that in relation to our maunga. And I think it's beautiful because from a Māori standpoint, it speaks to the fact that we are the resting places of our tupuna maunga as they are of us. And so this sort of this enduring relationship in life and death that we have which is intergenerational with our tupuna maunga. And so what that sort of means is that we have this obligation and responsibility to be able to uphold all of those things that make our maunga who they are, which also make us who we are. And so, again, it reinforces that relationship and that connection that we have with our tupuna. The third one there, ko te kāhui tupua, ko te pune heke mai ai te tangata. The end of the day is when we ka tū tātou, when we stand to do our pepeha, ko Taranaki Maunga, that immediately locates us within the whenua and the landscape. And so, Taranaki is central to our identity, as we spoke earlier, not only from a whakapapa standpoint in terms of where we're located within our landscape, but the maunga is also a sense of culture, tikanga, reo. It's shaped our art form, a lot of our practice, the materials we use, how we view things, the metaphors and symbols we use are very much inspired by our tupuna maunga. And so, again, this reminds us of the important role that our maunga plays in our own well-being, and also our broader identity and the regional identity too, recognising that non-Māori have this relationship and connection with our tupuna. Ko tupua kaua, ko tawhito kaua e kawaora, tēnei mea te kawaora. So when we talk about this concept of kawaora, we're talking about the principle of natural law, L-O-R-E. And so this very much speaks to all of those, yes, spiritual, cultural, but the physical elements of our tupuna. So it's talking about the why, it's talking about ngā tamariki hatane, the fauna, the flora, and all of those natural elements of the maunga. And then the final one is what we sort of refer to as being critical, drawing upon the kōrero of Te Witi o Rongomai when he identified Taranaki as he puna koro pupu, he manawa whenua, which is a beautiful concept around Taranaki being that wellspring of well-being, identity, and so on and so forth, and the important role that each and every one of us play in terms of being active in our responsibility and our obligation back to our maunga, and recognising that this is an intergenerational kaupapa. Harei te mea ka mutu I konei, koenei noi ho he tahi mahi, kei te kawea tunutia tēnei mahi. So it just reminds us that this is very much intergenerational, and thinking about decisions we make today and the implications for future generations, which is second nature to us because that's just how we're wired, but that is also recorded here. So I think the key thing with these values, a lot of people will look at them and think, well, part of the process, and something that we always remind people of, is that what we've done with these negotiations, we've created a framework. It's a bit like we've built a house and we've provided all of the tools and post agreement through the implementation phase, there's an opportunity to adorn the house, and to think about how all of these things will be brought to life beyond the framework. And so what these pou do is they provide an opportunity for these elements to be interpreted and to be applied in decision making at a governance policy, but also at an operational level, and they're fundamental to all of the arrangements that we've negotiated. Anything you want to add, Liana?
No, I think the next lot of slides really talk about the effect of the legal personality and ngā pou whakatupua. So again, you'll see on each of these title slides that we've got is a kōrero whakawai, a whakataukitanga kōrero, that really speaks to why we are doing what we're doing, and it really tries to make the redress agreement ours as opposed to a standard kind of Crown document, I guess is what you'd say. Is we've really tried to put our kōrero whakawai throughout this document. So if we just talk about the effect of te kāhui tupua and ngā pou whakatupua. So these two concepts, the legal personality and the values, are really the foundation for what will be the new governance, management and administration for, and you'll see the term there, Te Papakura or Taranaki. That will become the new official name of the national park. We'll talk about that shortly, but when we're referring to Te Papakura or Taranaki, that's the national park. So really we put up front legal personality, te kāhui tupua, and the values, ngā pou whakatupua, because they are embedded throughout the redress arrangements that we've negotiated. So in relation to the national park, as Jamie set out in terms of the 5 Crown parameters, the National Parks Act will continue to apply, except as we've amended it through these negotiations and the legislation that will follow. So the national park purposes will still apply, and essentially the national park purposes talk to things that actually are things that we value too. So biodiversity, conservation values. There is something in there about public access, because that's a part of being retained as a national park, that public access will continue to apply where it's allowed, of course. And also, one of the things that is going to be important about the values is that when you're looking at hierarchy of legislation, actually the values are going to be legislated for. So those values, ngā pou whakatupua that Jamie just took you through, will sit inside the Maunga legislation. And what will happen is that legislation will sit alongside the National Parks Act. So they both are sitting at the same level, so they both have the same importance. So you don't have the National Park sitting above the Maunga legislation, and you don't have the Maunga legislation sitting above the National Parks legislation. They sit alongside each other. And what becomes important about ngā pou whakatupua is that essentially, because they're going to be entrenched in the deed as well as in legislation, anything that happens within the national park in Te Papakura or Taranaki have to be consistent with these values. And what we've done through the negotiations is set up that essentially it's our people, it's us as uri, that need to be interpreting those values and how they should apply. And so we've set things up within, throughout the mechanisms that we've negotiated, that these values sit up here, and if there is activity that is not consistent with them, then essentially that activity won't be able to occur. And so this applies for if we look at surrounding lands. So before I talked about the fact that our tupuna don't stop at the national park boundary. What that means is that Te Kāhui Tupua as a legal personality could be deemed to be an affected party, for example. So if there's an activity happening on whenua that sits outside of the park, but there's an impact on our tupuna, then our Te Kāhui Tupua could participate in those kinds of forum. We're just sort of picking up some questions as we're going. So tēnā koe Leone, talking about are there points of potential conflict. What we've tried to do is the arrangements that we're negotiating through the deed and our legislation, essentially, we're amending the National Parks Act where there are differences with what we've negotiated in the deed. And so what will happen in the National Parks Act is that if there's something specific for Taranaki Maunga that we've negotiated and is in our legislation, the National Parks Act will be amended to say, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, it will say something like, this will apply for national parks except for Taranaki Maunga, or in the case of Taranaki Maunga, this is what applies. So that's how we've tried to deal with the conflicts, is that actually we're going to, where the National Park Act needs to be amended to I guess, provide for what we've negotiated, then that act will be amended. So there shouldn't be points of conflict, ideally. Yeah.
And I think the key thing is a lot of the detail that we've been working through at negotiation, we have been around reconciling the two. And so our view has always been to have Te Kāhui Tupua, Ngā Paupaka Tupua, and our legislation sort of taking the sort of lead. But it's interesting because, as Liana said earlier, once we got a bit deeper into, if you start to really delve a bit deeper into various sections of the National Parks Act, particularly the purposes at 4.1, what you find is actually they're not too dissimilar to the values that we've outlined. They're just framed differently. And so that took us a while to sort of reconcile. But actually, once we got into it, I think there was a view that actually we're not too far apart.
Ka pai, thanks, Jay. So now we get on to Te Tōpuni Kōkorangi. I wonder, Jay, before I present the slides, you want to just talk about that ingoa?
Yeah, so Te Tōpuni, so we've used what we've tried to do again. So as I said earlier, so we're creating a framework. It's all about our maunga. It's about, te mana o te kāhui, but we've also looked to take the opportunity to ensure that the arrangements and the language reflect our worldview. And so with the group, so as Liana said, we've got Te Kāhui Tupua, the legal person, our maunga. They need a group to be their face and voice. And so we've called this group Te Tōpuni Kōkorangi, Tōpuni being a group. Kōkorangi is pretty topical now after Rangi Mātāmua because, the sort of stargazers. But the name Te Tōpuni Kōkorangi was very much around the important role that this group plays in terms of charting the path for Te Kāhui Tupua. And we want this group to be very ambitious. And so you'll see there that there's, again, a kōrero sort of brought to life by Hemi, which talks about this concept of, when we, at night, if you're to sit on your porch and you're to gaze to the sky, to the stars, ngā kanohi o te rangi, what does that invoke? And so the key thing here is that, very much the settlement is about shifting mindsets and attitudes in the way in which we view and see and feel about our tupuna maunga and the natural world. And so, part of Te Tōpuni Kōkorangi's role is to advocate for people shifting the way in which they think, their mindsets. And so, I love this kōrero because it also reminds us from time to time to take our own time to sit back and actually think about and dream about, new ways and new opportunities. But importantly for this group, it's about the roles and responsibilities that it will, its role and responsibility and the functions it will undertake moving forward on behalf of our tupuna maunga.
Kia ora, Jamie. I just saw a question there about projected minimum review period, and I guess we do talk about the review period for the management plan, but essentially this is going to be legislated for, so we won't be reviewing the deed of agreement or the legislation, and at any point in the future when, if a review is required or we need to amend something, then that will be something that's jointly done between Ngā iwi o Taranaki and the Crown. But if we do talk about review periods for the management planning documents, so we'll address that later on in the slide. Let us know, Kahu, if that didn't answer the question in the comments, and we'll come back to it. Ka pai. So Te Tōpuni Kōkorangi will be established as a statutory body. And its clear purpose is to be the human face and voice of Te Kāhui Tupua. So we talked about Te Kāhui Tupua being a legal personality, being able to hold assets, manage assets, buy and sell assets, it can appear in court, it can give submissions. But obviously our tupuna needs someone to do that for them. So that's what Te Tōpuni Kōkorangi his main function will be. And there's a number of functions within the redress agreements where Te Tōpuni Kōkorangi has a role in terms of governance, management decisions under these arrangements and under the redress legislation as well as the National Parks Act. So essentially there'll be 8 members on Te Tōpuni Kōkorangi. 4 will be appointed by the Crown and 4 will be appointed by Te Tōpuni Ngarahu. So we'll talk about Te Tōpuni Ngarahu later in the presentation, but essentially Te Tōpuni Ngarahu is the collective 8 iwi entity that's been created as a part of these arrangements. The key thing is, even though members are going to be appointed by the Crown or by Te Tōpuni Ngarahu, the iwi collective entity, they're not there to represent the interests of those groups. So they're not there representing the Crown and they're not there representing the iwi. They are there being the human face and voice and acting for and on behalf of our tupuna te kahui tupua. And so one of the criteria that we put into the mechanisms for appointments to Te Tōpuni Kōkorangi, there's a series of criteria. And one of the, well, there's a few things, but essentially the criteria are about understanding ngā pou whakatupua. So we talked about the Maunga values. So having an understanding of those values, having an understanding of the relationship of ngā iwi o Taranaki with te kahui tupua as uri. And so there are a number of criteria. I think the majority of them, Jamie, we've talked about this, really line up for our people to be appointed to this entity in terms of having that intimate knowledge of the relationship and the intimate knowledge of ngā pou whakatupua. I think there's one criteria in there that talks about was it biodiversity, natural science, conservation, tourism is kind of one of the criteria, and then the others sort of play to our strengths is how I would put it. So conceivably a little bit like Te Awa Tupua, where the Crown appointed Whae Tariana to as the Crown appointed Pou. It's highly conceivable that our people could also be appointed by the Crown as well. Aroha, I'm just catching up with this question here, Kahu, in terms of the working terms of reference for legislative review. So we haven't there isn't a terms of reference for legislative review for the Maunga legislation, but we have written in some mechanisms for upcoming legislative review. In terms of the internal stuff, we'll talk about that process in terms of the opportunity for our people to understand the full deed of agreement and the full draft legislation, so that there will be time for that to be reviewed by all of us prior to signing off on the final deed of agreement. In terms of Te Tōpuni Kōkorangi, talked about it being there to act and speak on behalf and in the name of Te Kahui Tupua, but also upholding and promoting the health and well-being. So everything we talk about is really where there is funding provided, all of that funding is going towards the health and well-being of our tupuna and the arrangements that we're looking at. One of the key things as the face and voice is that the collective iwi entity, Te Tōpuni Ngarahu, will be able to enter into a direct relationship with Te Tōpuni Kōkorangi, but also equally our iwi and hapu will be able to enter into direct relationship with Te Tōpuni Kōkorangi as well. So what we're trying to do is ensure that the ability of our whānau, our hapu and our iwi to engage directly with the face and voice of our tupuna is open. And we're not trying to have a one-stop shop with a collective iwi entity, and that those individual relationships are still protected. There's also provision in the agreement for Te Tōpuni Kokorangi as the face and voice to enter into a direct relationship agreement with the Minister of Conservation and Director General. And then there's a standard provision to form relationships with other agencies, whether that be the Taranaki Maunga Conservation Board, Conservation Authority, or anyone else that undertakes a particular function that might impact on Te Kāhui Tupua. One of the key outcomes of the negotiations is, in a current context, we have the Department of Conservation and the Taranaki Maunga Conservation Board are responsible for developing the management plan for the park. So essentially, the management plan is the document that sets out what you can and can't do within the park, essentially. And so with the management plan, how it currently works is the Conservation Board develops it, the Department of Conservation drafts it, they go through a public process for that, and then the New Zealand Conservation Authority approves it and signs it off. What will be happening under the new arrangements is that Te Tōpuni Kokorangi, as the face and voice of our tupuna, they will be developing the management plan. And so, and they will recommend that plan for approval. So unlike the current situation where the Conservation Board does that, Te Tōpuni Kokorangi as the face and voice will be doing that going forward. We will talk more about the whole management plan process because that comes up shortly. And we've just preserved the New Zealand Conservation Authority being able to provide feedback on it, but they no longer approve the management plan. So sitting in this slide, there are a number of particular functions that relate to that Te Tōpuni Kokorangi will be responsible for as a part of these arrangements. And so you'll see there the use of he kawa ora. He kawa ora is the name that we've given to the management plan for the park. So interpreting that, looking at the implementation of Conservation General Policy and monitoring that is all a part of Te Tōpuni Kokorangi's role as the face and voice. But also where there are applications for interests in land, and when I talk about interests in land, we're looking at concessions where there might be a lease of land or a license to occupy for land or a particular easement. Those decisions are currently made by the Minister of Conservation. So currently there are two types of concessions. There's the interest in land concessions, and then there are your normal activity kind of concessions. And so the interest in land concessions will, going forward, be a joint decision made by the Minister of Conservation and Te Tōpuni Kokorangi, which is the face and voice of our maunga. So it won't be the minister making the decisions on their own for the interest in land concessions. And so I guess there's a whole lot here. I'll just sort of highlight some of the key things. So as a legal person, I talked about the company, Te Kāhui Tupua being able to own assets. If it owns assets, so say somebody leaves it some money, or leaves them some land, or vests some land in Te Kāhui Tupua, that land needs to be managed by somebody. And so we've set into the framework that Te Tōpuni Kokorangi, as the face and voice of Te Kāhui Tupua, could establish an asset management company that manages any assets that Te Kāhui Tupua might have on their behalf. So that's kind of a part of Te Tōpuni Kokorangi's functions. There are a number of little things that sort of, as you can imagine, as the face and voice of our tupuna, Te Tōpuni Kokorangi will be having to having to undertake. And so this is kind of just a list of some of the key ones. Our favourite. Jamie, you want to talk about this one?
So, well, kia ora tātou. So, one of the key elements when we were developing the aspirations framework for negotiations was the Mount Egmont Vesting Act 1978. And many of our whānau may be or may not be aware of what led up to this particular piece of legislation and what followed. But if, in short, sort of about the sort of early 1970s, a lot of the kaupapa in relation to our tupuna maunga were being advanced by the Taranaki Māori Trust Board. And just sitting with Rukutai on Friday night, we sort of reminded of, this has been a bit of a 50-year journey, because the sort of more recent attempts of our tauheke around our maunga sort of really commenced again in the early 1970s. And what that led to was this particular piece of legislation in 1978, which led to the maunga being handed back to Ngaiwi or Taranaki, on the basis that the maunga would then be gifted back as a symbol of love to the nation the same day. And I think we shouldn't. And so, there was a lot of mamai, there was a lot of angst around the process and the outcome, and it caused a whole long-lasting mamai with a number of our whānau and across our rohe. And so, when we embarked on this process, and it's something that we impressed upon the then Minister Christopher Finlayson, that a key part of these negotiations would be to repeal this piece of legislation, on the basis that, it had caused a lot of harm and mamai in terms of, that long-lasting sort of impact. And so, so pleasingly, as part of the negotiations here, we are repealing that piece of legislation, and we can draw a line through that era. But I think just sort of reflecting back, often we don't understand the challenges and the difficulties that some of our tauheke were going through. And, in that sort of 1970s period, ko ha tātou rangatira o Taranaki tonu, that's Liana's tauheke, Pehi Mana Tāmati, we had Uncle Sam Raumati, we had Kui Moi Rewa, Hoani Hiramea, a lot of our rangatira at that time advancing this particular kaupapa, and so we acknowledge and remember them. But I think importantly, we can close the book on that part of our history. But I think the reminder for me on Friday, talking to Rukutai, who was a mukapuna of Kui Moi Rewa, it's sort of taken us 50 years since that generation embarked on the process, which really involved the return of the maunga and the recognition of the name Taranaki, because that was 78. And then, of course, in the 1980s, we had a whole lot of issues around the name Taranaki and what eventually happened with the dual naming and the uproar. But I think it's always important for us to remember those things. But importantly for us as part of this process is we can say goodbye to that piece of legislation.
Hi, Jay. So, he tapanga whenua, official geographic name changes. We've talked about some of them. So just noting that through this process, so there are two processes where you can change the official geographic name of a place. And so through one of those avenues is through treaty settlement negotiations, and the other is just an application directly to the Geographic Board. So what you'll see on the next slide, here we are, is that a number of name changes. They are not all the name changes for every place within the park, but they are the names that were ready to to go in terms of be put forward to the Geographic Board at this time. It doesn't mean that others can't change in the future. So the first name that you've got there, Te Kāhui Tupua, will be the name of the legal personality for the multiple tupuna maunga. Down the bottom there, you have Te Papakura or Taranaki, which I talked about before, as being the name for the national park. So it won't be Te Papakura o Taranaki National Park. It won't be Te Papakura o Taranaki / Egmont National Park / Taranaki National Park. It will just be Te Papakura o Taranaki. And this is the first time that the Geographic Board has recommended and supported a reo Māori only name for a national park. So we're really pleased to have got that outcome. Similarly with Taranaki Maunga, Taranaki Maunga will be the Taranaki Maunga with an A. We got questioned about that. It's some of our iwi updates because some wanted the O. It's the same Maunga, whether it's AU or OU, and we've had to make some compromises in terms of, where different iwi, different hapus sit on in terms of names. So we've gone with Taranaki Maunga. Again, this is the first time that the Geographic Board has recommended and supported a reo Māori only descriptor for a natural feature. So it won't be called Taranaki Maunga / Mount Taranaki. The Egmont name will be gone, and it will just be Taranaki Maunga. Likewise with our other peaks, so Panitahi will be Panitahi and not Phantom's Peak. Pauakai, Patuha and Kaitake, while their names are commonly used, we found out through this process they weren't actually official geographic names. So we've had the Geographic Board agree to that, and we've put in some tohuto macrons on those. And then you'll see 4 place names within the park who will be changed. Mangoraukawa will be that and not Lake Dive. Te Rere o Tahurangi will be that and not Bells Falls. Te Ahu Kawakawa will be that and not the Sphagnum Moss Swamp. And Te Tahuna o Tūtawa will be that and not Warwick's Castle. The other name changes we were successful on through this process were some of the awa. So those of you that may remember through the land settlements, when the individual iwi were going through name changes through their settlements, they couldn't change the names of an awa if they began in the national park and flowed out. And so now we are changing a number of awa. So Oakura will be Oakura Matapu, will be the official name for the river. Waria River will be Te Ika Pārua, and the Stony will return to Hangatahua and Hangatahua on its own. Won't have Stony in brackets. And so there are those waterway changes that are also happening. And that's why I just prefaced this discussion, because some have said, what about Te Rere Anoke and Te Rere o Kapuni? Those names weren't quite ready to go for this process, so they'll come through another process. Vesting of land and minerals, you want to crack at that, Jay?
Yeah, so this is another key provision. I'll talk about the sort of the minerals piece of it. And essentially, because we have the establishment of Te Kāhui Tupua, the legal person, what that provides is for both minerals and land to be vested in Te Kāhui Tupua. And so there are a number of minerals which are found in within Te Kāhui Tupua. So these are things like te kōkowai, kōkawa, pākohe, onewa, mata. And essentially what will happen there is that these particular minerals are vested in Te Kāhui Tupua. And then we have also the vesting of land. So you'll see there's a category called whenua taketake, which is essentially, that's the Crown land, isn't it, Liana, that is vested in the parkland that will be vested in the name of Te Kahui Tupua. So from a title standpoint, if you were to look at who owns the land, which currently sort of forms the national park, it will be in the name of Te Kahui Tupua and not in the name of the Crown. And then there's a whole lot of technical detail around sort of which lands are inalienable, and a whole lot of processes around how you include land as part of the national Te Papakuro Taranaki, and how over time, and then how you remove land and so on and so forth. And essentially, whānau, what we've sought to do is to, initially there was different sort of Pākehā names for these parcels of land, and so we brought to life our reo around the various categories of land, and technical in nature. But the key thing here, whānau, is that, you know, what we've sought to do is that Te Kahui Tupua will own the land that will form Te Papakuro Taranaki. There's clear processes and rules around how you include further land, or the status of lands that might have been gifted by adjoining landowners, and also how you might remove land from the park, Te Papakuro Taranaki. But yeah, very technical in nature, but I think this took quite some time, didn't it, Liana, just working through all of the technicalities, because, you know, the arrangements here are not sort of typical from a legal standpoint, but I think we've got through all of it, and it's looking pretty good.
So he kawa ora mo te Papakuro Taranaki. This is the management plan that we were talking about before. And again, the management plan is something that really sets out what activities can and can't happen within the national park. That's a really generic kind of framing up of it. And as I said, currently prepared by the Conservation Board, but going forward will be prepared by Te Tōpuni Kokorangi, the face and voice. So I'll just take you through some of the key elements of this. So again, Te Tōpuni Kokorangi will be responsible for the oversight and preparation of the draft. So Te Tōpuni Ngarahu, which is the collective iwi entity, and the Director General will each appoint one lead planner to work together to draft, essentially, he kawa ora, the management plan. Currently, that sits within the Department of Conservation, and they provide all the planning advice and drafting services, but this is going to be a joint process. There'll still be a public process, so if you are familiar with the current management plan process, there is a public notification of it once it's ready for consideration. There's an opportunity to be heard and provide submissions on it. So that process will still occur, but it will be Te Tōpuni Kokorangi as the face and voice of the tupuna who hears those submissions and manages that process, as opposed to the Conservation Board currently. And the key aspect is he kawa ora will be approved jointly by the Minister of Conservation and Te Tōpuni Ngarahu, the collective iwi entity. So currently that's approved by the New Zealand Conservation Authority, and so going forward it will be a joint decision for approval. And here we've got just that last point is the review and amendment. So the plan must be reviewed no later than 10 years. Some of you familiar with the space know that our current management plan is significantly out of date, so we've brought in that 10-year review period.
So these, I mean, in the interest of being sort of just showing all of the arrangements, there's another section within the deed again that just sets out other matters and functions of Te Tōpuni Kokorangi. So we included quite an extensive list earlier on in a couple of slides in terms of the purpose of Te Tōpuni Kokorangi as the face and the voice, advocating for Te Kahui Tupua and some of the other functions that it will be undertaking. Again, we start with one of our kōrero that sort of frame up the section of Te Ruruku Pūtakerongo. essentially, one of some of the other functions of Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi, the name Te Kāhui Tupua will be protected, and so they will have the ability to approve the use of the name Te Kāhui Tupua, and that's really on the basis that because Te Kāhui Tupua is the name of the legal person for these arrangements, then it's only appropriate that there are particular tikanga and protections around that name. Taonga tūturu, so many of you will be aware that there's an existing process around taonga tūturu in terms of a process when taonga are found, and the process that is undertaken there in terms of one, how they're held by the Ministry of Culture and Heritage, and also the sort of Māori Land Court process. Under these arrangements, basically those taonga will be, the interim sort of ownership arrangements will be with Te Kāhui Tupua, and therefore Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi will have a role to play. Liana touched earlier on the process of asset management, and so this section of Te Ruruku Pūtakerongo just outlines some of the more technical elements around how the asset management entity is established and what some of the rules are around that and the establishment of the management company. And then one of the other key pieces is that within the broader sort of conservation arrangements, there is what is called a conservation management strategy, or the CMS, which in terms of the hierarchy of conservation documentation and arrangements is quite high. And so what we've done there is to ensure that there's a separate section available for Te Papakura o Taranaki. And that's really one to ensure that it's not lost and there's opportunities to be able to bring to life those elements of Te Papakura o Taranaki that are relevant. And then Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi, as we outlined earlier, will have multiple relationships, but one of the key relationships it will have is with the Minister and the Director General of the Department of Conservation. And we've called this relationship Te Takapau Tupua, because we see it as being quite critical to elevate, those take of importance between Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi on behalf of Te Kāhui Tupua with the Minister and the Director General of Conservation.
So resourcing, reporting and liabilities. So when we kicked into these negotiations, they were always on the basis that they were cultural redress negotiations and that there wouldn't be any financial redress because that was deemed to have been settled and provided for in our 8 individual settlements. So we set about talking with the, obviously negotiating with the Crown negotiators, talking with the ministers about the fact that actually all of the arrangements that we were negotiating needed some resource to support the successful implementation of it. So if we click over, Jamie, what we sought through these negotiations was a Crown contribution to the resourcing of Te Tōpuni Ngarahu, which is the collective 8 iwi entity. To support, one, we could be providing pūtea to support the health and well-being of Te Kāhui Tupua. We could be providing resourcing and pūtea to help re-establish or strengthen relationships of ngā iwi o Taranaki with Te Kāhui Tupua. But also there are a number of statutory functions that Te Tōpuni Ngarahu as the collective iwi entity has to undertake, and appointing members to Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi is one of those. So we sought some resourcing to support that. Essentially, we while some of you you saw in an earlier slide that we entered into the Record of Understanding at the end of 2017, and we're now in 2023. Why did it take so long? We had 2 general elections in that time, but also there were 2 points at which we decided that actually we weren't, we hadn't reached a point where we could take the agreement out to our people to vote on, because we weren't happy with some of the, I guess, the Crown positions on some things, and resourcing was one of them. So I think we started, Jamie, I can't really remember what the starting number was, but we went up at different points.
Well, it was 0.
Yeah.
0 to 10.
10
a little
to
bit more than then the
13,
final was 20.
13 and then 20. So 20 was the full and final offer. And it was at that point that we said, well, that's not going to help sustain the arrangements. So we said we'll stop negotiations at that point. So we did. We stopped negotiations and we allowed time for the Crown to regroup. And then they came back to us the following year to kind of understand where this was at. So the figure that we've landed on is 35 million. And again, those 3 bullet points there is what that pūtea will be provided for. So it's not additional pūtea to go to the 8 individual iwi. It's pūtea for those 3 purposes. DOC will also obtain implementation funding to support the implementation of its obligations under these arrangements. They're also going to be covering the costs for the members they appoint to Te Tōpuni Kokorangi and the Secretariat for Te Tōpuni Kokorangi. And I guess the other key thing in terms of liabilities, and this has taken some time to work through, is that the Crown is going to retain certain liabilities. So if they are liabilities that rest with land ownership, i.e. Contamination, either past or in the future, those are the kinds of liabilities that the Crown will continue to retain. And part of that was a compromise because it will remain a national park and it will remain under the National Parks Act, that the Crown will retain some of those landowner liabilities, even though they aren't technically the landowner. So we've written those into the redress mechanisms. Management, kaiako.
Yeah, well, kapai. So one of the key things that we've also worked on is Ngāti Te Ngāmo Te Papakura o Taranaki. So thinking about the operational day-to-day management. And very much here when we were developing the aspirations framework and various discussions with the iwi, it sort of assisted to inform what our areas of focus would be for this. But to start with, in terms of the arrangements, DOC through the Director General will retain sort of management responsibility for Te Papakura o Taranaki. But what we have done is we've spent some time working through recording the aspirations that our various iwi have to be able to, in the future, take up particular functions or responsibilities at an operational level within Te Papakura o Taranaki. And you'll see there some of the three sub-bullet points. What we've pushed is that over time, there's an opportunity to develop some of the capability within our iwi, that we've got mechanisms that can be triggered in the future by individual iwi and hapu to ensure that they're able to enter into partnerships with the department, or alternatively to participate in operational management, and then also sort of explore some of these projects and partnerships. And what I guess is quite unique about Taranaki is that we have some existing projects in place, whether that be the Pauakai crossing project, whether that be what Ngā Ruahine are doing around Te Rere o Kapuni, Dawson Falls, or Project Maunga, where we've been able to demonstrate, positively the work that iwi are undertaking and the contribution iwi are making. So the key thing here, whānau, because we're creating a framework, part of the framework, we've always got an eye to the future to ensure that we're providing some optionality. So, future options for our iwi to be able to be more active within Te Kāhui Tupu in the future. One of the other big pieces for us was to ensure that any concession revenue generated from Te Papakura o Taranaki was reinvested back into Te Papakura o Taranaki. And so a lot of focus, because what normally happens with concession monies, so concessions whānau are basically a license or a permit, an agreement to be able to undertake activities, is that we are asking for all of that. Well, we've negotiated that all of that money be reinvested back on Maunga. And, you know, we've been working through what the amounts are. The sort of major concession that exists on the Maunga at the moment is the Cordia concession, which you'll see. And so there's been some discussions about ensuring that Te Korimako, for example, which then in turn benefits us all as Taranaki, is supported in terms of that relationship with Cordia. But the key thing, I mean, that we like is the money's not going into the central pot of government. It's all got to be reinvested back on Maunga. And what we've done is we've set out within the arrangements some of the accountability and transparency mechanisms for DOC to be able to demonstrate and report to Te Tōpuni Kōkorangi around the amounts received, how those funds have been applied, and, you know, basically what the impact and benefit of those funds are for Te Papakura o Taranaki and Te Kāwi Tupua. Yeah, and so as Liana's covered this off, the other key thing is that with He Kawaora, the management plan, jointly, the pen is going to be jointly held by the department and also Te Tōpuni Ngarahu. And as I said earlier, I mean, one of the key things is that we're trying to bring a greater place-based accountability to the table, because ultimately we want to ensure that the Director General, the Department of Conservation, that they're being held to account. And so we're doing that by ensuring there are mechanisms such as business planning and reporting back to Te Tōpuni Kōkorangi on an annual basis around how they're going about implementing He Kawaora, the management plan, and again, as I said earlier, how they are applying funds that are generated from Te Papakura o Taranaki. And then again, just ensuring that there are those mechanisms available for Ngā iwi o Taranaki at the appropriate time to be able to participate in operations or any contracting opportunities that might arise through particular procurement and the like.
So that essentially covers off all of those 11 redress elements under Ko Te Mana o Ngā Maunga. And so now we move into the second pou of our negotiations framework, which is Ko Te Mana o Te Kāhui. And again, this is about recognising and providing for our relationship as uri with our tupuna. So I'll take you through, I think there are four key redress components under this particular pou, which are cultural redress, governance, the relationship redress for Te Tōpuni Ngarahu, the iwi collective group, and also there's some legal technical stuff about non-derogation and standing that we'll cover off with you. So cultural redress, I mean, when you look at where we started, the entire agreement is cultural redress, because that's the component that was missing out of the individual 8 iwi settlements. And so, you know, when we talk about cultural redress, it's really, I guess in this section, it's the cultural redress stuff that isn't covered as a part of the overall arrangements. So the key part of this is Te I o Tāngaingai, so that's the collective statement of connection and relationship. So Jamie went through those 3 key things at the beginning. So when we talk about the social, physical dimension of our tupuna, and we had, as he said, we'd hoped that we might have 8 individual iwi statements, but that became quite a difficult task. So we've come to an agreement on one collective statement, and we've kept it really high level so that it's really inclusive of the 8, so that will be a part of it. The official geographic name changes is a part of the, while it's enhancing and acknowledging our tupuna, it's also a part of our cultural redress, our relationship redress. There will be also arrangements in place for cultural take of materials from within the national park. And so as a part of that cultural take process will be the development of a cultural materials plan. So many of our toi Māori whānau already access different materials and resources from within the park, and that's through the Department of Conservation. But what we'll be doing through these arrangements is creating a cultural materials plan, that will set out, provide some guidelines and criteria in terms of how cultural materials can be accessed and how they can be taken and used for cultural purposes. Iwi access to facilities, we always have a chuckle about this because I think the department offered up, 5 days or so to be able to use their facilities, their hut facilities. You can imagine what our response to that was, but there's still going to be within the arrangements the ability for iwi to access different facilities within Te Papakura or Taranaki for cultural purposes.
Pai, and then so what? One of the other aspects of the arrangements, which we've called Ko Te Pai Manukura, speaks to what you've heard throughout the presentation, Te Tōpuni Ngarahu. Te Tōpuni Ngarahu being the collective entity of our 8 iwi of Taranaki, which you can see here. And essentially Te Tōpuni Ngarahu will hold assets. So Liana talked about the 35 million of resourcing that will come back to support those 3 key areas of focus that we outlined earlier. And then it will also be responsible for discharging the other statutory functions that are outlined within the broader arrangements here. And so what are they? Appointing Te Tōpuni Kōkorangi members, appointing a person to hold the pen around the joint drafting of He Kawaora, the management plan. And then there's some other sort of matters which relate to the redress arrangements. And what we have here, whānau, is that we haven't prescribed how each of the iwi will appoint their members. So each of the runanga or the trusts that you see there in black will be responsible for their own processes around how they appoint people to Te Tōpuni Ngarahu Trust. The key thing, though, whānau, is that the trust has a set of accountabilities that are in place, so it will be required to have a 5-year plan, an annual plan, audited accounts, furnish an audit report, annual report, and then also an annual general meeting among the members. And so, yes, Te Tōpuni Ngarahu, the name, again, Tōpuni being a group, Ngarahu is our word for embers, and so we've that sort of reminds us that the role and function here is one of he kaimahi, and being very connected to the ground and to place. And so koira te tūturutanga o te ingoa Te Tōpuni Ngarahu.
So similar to the individual iwi settlements, there will be relationship redress for Te Tōpuni Ngarahu, with some slight tweaks, I guess, is how we describe it. So there will be a relationship agreement between the Minister of Conservation and Te Tōpuni Ngarahu. And really this relationship will set out a number of things. So there are a number of, when we were negotiating different parts of the redress, we decided rather than prescribe all of that in the deed and in the legislation, that we would reserve that to be done as a part of the relationship agreement. So, how the 2 parties will form a positive and enduring partnership based on te tiriti, how we'll work together to ensure that the integrity of he kawa tupua, he kawa tupua, he kawa ora, and te kāhui tupua, I think that is, or he kawa tupua is our framework. So essentially how we will make sure that the redress arrangements we've negotiated, that there's integrity in that and that they're upheld. So what we are really conscious of is we don't want a whole lot of, legislative reform to come in that actually undermines what we've negotiated. So that's one of the key things that will be a part of the relationship redress, as well as developing operational processes. So as you'll see through the arrangements, there's a lot of interaction between Te Tōpuni Ngarahu, the Minister of Conservation, the Department, the Director General, and so this relationship agreement will set out basically how that engagement takes place and at what point those engagements will take place. We touched on this earlier around having an express provision relating to iwi and hapu, and this is twofold really. One, to protect the relationships that iwi and hapu already have with our tupuna, and the fact that they already exercise a number of rights and functions in regards to our rohe whenua, but also really entrenching that the department, regardless of these arrangements in the redress package, the department specifically and the Crown still have obligations under Section 4 of the Conservation Act to give effect to the principles of te tiriti. So what we're trying to do is make sure that there are two parts to it. One, that iwi and hapu can still be engaging and advocating and do what they do regardless of the establishment of Te Tōpuni Ngarahu in these arrangements, but also that Te Tōpuni Ngarahu as the collective entity isn't used as the one-stop engagement shop, and that the Director General and the Department still have responsibilities to individual iwi and hapu to engage with them when they're undertaking operational and management planning activities. So this part is really about preserving those relationships at all levels, and one's not usurping the other, and these arrangements aren't coming in to take over anything that the iwi and hapu are already engaging in.
Then one of the final, which is more of a technical sort of section, but it really reflects, non-derogation and standing. And so when we talk about non-derogation, it's really clear around what the intention and effect is for the arrangements we have and what's not intended. And so, these sections are really important in terms of that clarity, but also really important in terms of the standing provisions around Te Kahui Tupua through Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi, and how it might participate in particular processes. And so, we've got non-derogation provisions, as I said, so that really just sets out what the intentions are, what it's not intended to do. But I think really the key thing we wanted to highlight here is really the standing that Te Kahui Tupua has through Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi. So effectively, Te Kahui Tupua through Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi will be treated as though it is an iwi authority and a public authority for the purposes of the RMA. So in practical terms, that gives Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi on behalf of Te Kahui Tupua the ability to make submissions and to participate in particular planning processes. And it will also be a public body for the purposes of the LGA, the Local Government Act 2002. And so what that provides, there is the ability for the Maunga to have voice and mana and standing in particular fora, but it doesn't in any way displace the role and the ability for iwi individually or collectively to also participate in those same processes. So, so we think it's really important that, if we're going to give our tupuna legal personhood, it has the sort of rights and powers as we do as people, then we've got to make sure that it's actually practical and tangible so it can participate in those things, in those processes of importance.
Haere tonu, Jay.
Ka pai. And then we've got a whole lot of provisions which are around implementation. So we're coming to the back end. And like all of these things, as I said, it's a really good reminder that what we've done as a negotiations team is created a framework. And a lot of our engagement and interaction with our whānau and our iwi has been, actually the work starts once these arrangements have been approved, because it requires, this implementation process is going to be fundamental to the success of what we've negotiated and ensuring that these arrangements are durable for the future. And so, we've just, these sort of points around how the arrangements come into effect and how they're implemented, conditions more technical in nature, provisions around the effect of Te Ruruku Pūtakerongo. So again, as Liana has outlined, with the deed and the bill, and also the values. But one of the key elements that we have is relates to any conservation reform. So we've been working through the drafting. So many of you will be aware that there's been some major reform in the resource management area with the RMA. And so what we've got is some provisions which basically set out a bit of a process in the event that the Crown look to reform conservation legislation. In that regard, the minimum is that we retain what we currently have, but we've also framed that positively. So in the event that the reform program creates broader and better opportunities than what we have here, then we want the ability to be able to, for our tupuna and for our iwi to benefit from those reforms. And so that's the main thing. But, I think, but broadly speaking, whānau, that, once we get through this, implementation is going to be critical to the success. And we basically have here the arrangements on one page. So we've talked about Te Kāhui Tupua in terms of establishment of the legal person and what that provides and the powers. We've got Ngā Pouwaka Tupua in the status statement. So a reminder of, those 5 values that we outlined and our Maunga Te Kāhui Tupua being an indivisible and living whole from the peaks through to the surrounding lands. And so that's a key piece around, although we have been constrained in terms of redress to matters within the national park, the reality is our tupuna extends beyond the current national park boundaries. You've then got Te Papakuro Taranaki, so the arrangements in relation to Te Papakuro Taranaki, so He Kawaora being the management plan, and what that provides, and then the particular decision-making there. The operational management, so we've gone through that in terms of DOC retaining operational management. One of the key elements there was, the sort of liability and responsibility. But importantly, whānau, what we have done is within the framework we've created mechanisms and hooks for iwi at the appropriate time, or collectively to be able to trigger those mechanisms to have a much more active role within the operational management on Maunga. We have Te Tōpuni Kōkorangi, so appointed 50-50, 50% by iwi, 50% by the Crown, outlining there what some of the key functions of Te Tōpuni Kōkorangi are. We then have Te Tōpuni Ngarahu, the collective iwi entity, and what its key role and functions are. And then the other redress, which we've talked about earlier, around an agreed historical account, the Crown acknowledgements, apology, the name changes, ngā tapanga wenua, the resourcing, and importantly, ko te wakakoretanga o te rā ture, so the repeal of the Egmont Vesting Act. So that's it all on a one page. Some of you may be looking at this and like, 6 years, what took you so long? What you'll see, whānau, that after the initially next week, we will be providing online and at particular locations sort of copies of Te Ruruku Pūtakerongo and the bill. And, it's a few hundred pages, but when you look at it, because Liana and I have been in the detail of this for a number of years now, along with Hemi and others, Te Pahunga. But, all of the wording, the drafting, and ensuring that, a lot of our focus as we've been going through the detailed drafting have centered around ensuring that these arrangements are going to practically work, because what we are creating here and what we have negotiated here and what we're creating here is something very novel. And so a lot of our discussions around the table have been testing the practical effect of, what we're putting in place, which has been really important. Oh, all right, mate.
So I guess where we're at now is, as Jamie said, we've been negotiating the collective redress deed, Te Ruruku Pūtakerongo, and what you would have heard, and there would have been pānui circulating, that we are moving to initial a redress deed, a deed of agreement, this coming Friday, the 31st of March at Aotearoa Pa. And so some people have asked, why are we going down there? We're sharing the love around the Maunga, but also this is the first time that we've been back in Taranaki formally, with a formal kind of milestone since Tihi's passing. And so we wanted to go back and acknowledge her and her mahi within Ngā Ruehine. So we will initial the agreement this coming Friday. The 8 iwi entities who have the mandate have all been considering this. Some are still considering it tomorrow, I think, and the next day, to kind of formally agree to proceed to the initialing. And what we have after that is the ratification process. So not dissimilar from the 8 iwi settlement processes, but essentially we will be going out to vote on the redress deed as well as the draft legislation. So once we initial, we will make available to everybody a full copy of the deed and a full copy of the draft legislation so that you have some time to work through it. There'll be an independent returning officer who will run the ratification process. The ratification process will be run through the 8 iwi. The complications and all the privacy kind of matters that we had to navigate to combine everybody into one voting list just became too difficult. And so for those of you that are registered with more than one iwi, you will be voting more than one time. And so the votes will be done according to iwi. So the results will come out as an iwi result, which is why there'll be if you're registered with multiple iwi, you can vote multiple times for those different iwi. We have a series of 14 kanohi ki te kanohi face-to-face hui for the ratification process, and 5 online hui. And one of those online hui will be dedicated to our whānau that live overseas, so that they can have their own sort of time to process some of this. There'll be a voting period. The voting period will last for at least 5 weeks, and it's probably going to take place towards the end of April, May. We'll kick that process off. And then once that process is finished, we'll be looking to sign formally Te Ruruku Pūtakerongo, the deed of agreement, in June, July of this year. And it's our hope that we will get the bill introduced into Parliament July, August, in the hope that we can do it before Parliament rises for the general election. Now, we're not, the impetus isn't to get this done and introduced before the general election. It's just the way that the timing has it's kind of fallen and landed in terms of where we've got to in negotiations. And actually, it was just last week, we got the final kind of decision from the ministers about the last remaining issue that we had. So that's why it may feel like the initialing's happening quickly, and that's because we only just sort of signed off the last agreement, last matter with the minister, and they made themselves available for the 31st. So there's a little bit of mahi to go after the 31st, but you would have seen the pānui going out. The ratification or the initialing ceremony will be live streamed via Te Koremako, the Facebook page. So if you can't make it in person to Aotearoa, then please join us online for that initialing ceremony. And also, if you are coming in person, please RSVP. I think all the 8 iwi entities have been sharing the information for that day. Please RSVP so that we know how many people we need to feed on that day. So that's kind of the plan for the ratification process. And yeah, I think we're kind of opening up for any partai at this point.
Okay. So we could probably take the PowerPoint down. Okay. Yeah, so kia ora whanau. So I'll just sort of make some comments because Liana, you make a really good point there around as we outlined, when we embarked on this process, yes, it was about our maunga, but it was also an opportunity to bring to life our ways of being and knowing, and so some of our mātauranga. And I think, through developing our framework, what we are providing is an opportunity for that to be further developed and enhanced over time. And I think we shouldn't underestimate, the real power of reclamation, I guess. And so, some of the key elements of the redress arrangements for me are about our names being restored. The fact that, it's a first in having reo Māori only descriptors. Taranaki Maunga, that alone, when I think about the 50-year fight of sort of the sort of more recent generations, getting to that point. And then, being able to bring a lot of our concepts to life through how we can actively participate at both governance and operational management sort of ends. So that's really important and have been key features. And I think it's something that we should be thinking about collectively around everything we do. And, Whaiatiri, I just see your comment there around, what happened in 1978. And we had the opportunity to talk about that context with Rukutai. And, I think, it's 50 years. And, as I said earlier, we acknowledge our tauheke, our kuia and our koroheke for their contribution. But times were very different then. And, I guess our generation don't realise how fortunate we are relative to, our grandparents. So I think, that's really critical, whānau. And the key thing is, as I said earlier, we're creating a framework and, with a future focus. I mean, the work will really start once these arrangements are supported by our whānau in that implementation phase. And, and how we can be much more engaged in these arrangements moving forward into the future. The only sort of last point for me is really around the ratification hui. So there's sort of 43,000 iwi members across the 8 registers. And so what we've done is we've analysed where the largest concentrations are of our whānau throughout the motu. And so that's why we're having 14 hui. There's some in Taranaki, but we're going to all of the major centres where there are large concentrations of our whānau. As part of the ratification process, we'll ensure that we get out the dates and the timing and all of those things to our whānau, and if there are key people within each of our regions or our centres, look to work with you around encouraging our whānau to come to our kanohi ki te kanohi hui.
And just picking up on the fact that, there might still be lots of questions, and actually the ratification hui are the perfect place to come and ask and have some of your questions answered there. And at that time, you would have had the full deed and the full draft legislation to look at. So that might prompt other questions as well. But definitely encouraging whānau to get along to those hui. There'll be online ones as well if we're not in your particular rohe. But yeah, 14 across the country. So we're definitely going to Auckland, Hamilton, Tauranga, Palmerston, Wellington, top of the south, Christchurch, Dunedin, and the rest will be in Taranaki. So there's a really good spread of of venues, so we'll make sure we get that info out to you. But in the meantime, you know, if you see us or catch up with us, and on Friday we'll be able to answer questions. You know, our team's available if you have other questions. Yeah.
Ka pai. Awa. Te ahu nei kua mutu te rerere mai o ngā pātai. So just on behalf of our team, just thank you all for making time this evening to join us, and really appreciate, we really appreciate that. And let the whānau know, because this presentation and recording will be on Te Korimako's Facebook page. And so those of our whānau or households that didn't join this evening, let them know that they can also watch this 2-hour event. I just noticed we've been going for 1 hour and 50 whānau, and so we always endeavour to sort of try and sort of keep it tight. But, you know, there's a lot of important information here to share. And so really on that, again, ka mihi kia koutou, I piri mai, ki tēnei hōtaka I te pōnei, me mihia hoki au ki a Te Korimako. So really grateful for the support of Te Korimako, and really, again, encourage you all, those of you that will not be able to travel to Taranaki on Friday next week for the initialing, you know, there will be the ability to watch that day being broadcast live on Te Korimako. And I just really wanted to end by saying, you know, Friday is really sort of, we as a negotiating team feel that we've done all we can, and we're comfortable with the fact that we've been able to negotiate the arrangements. And when we reflect on what we started with in terms of the parameters and the constraints and where we are today, we think it creates a fantastic foundation and opportunity for our iwi of today and those future generations. Nō reira, e mihi ana kia koutou. Nō reira, ka nui hēnei kōrero, kua pō, nō reira, māku te karakia whakamutunga, nō reira, ki runga, ki raro, ki roto, ki wao, rire au, pai mārire.